wanted to share with you scenes from outside the White House. Thousands of people here demonstrating in support of the Ukrainian people. Stop Putin, no war, Russian warship, go F yourself. There was a march that culminated here outside the White House. They've actually shut off Pennsylvania Avenue, which is well, it's actually in front of those black gates that you can see there. So everyone has come into the park that sits in front of the White House. You'll see the White House in the background there. People of all ages. I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to reflect on what does it mean to live in the 21st century. What political institutions do we need to provide security and governance in the 21st century? NATO, obviously, its history is as an organization against Russia. Maybe some of that needs to be rethought in the 21st century. One of the narratives that I don't think people are talking about enough is, yes, this is a war of aggression, but I think it's also a war from someone who feels threatened. I think it's aggression coming from feeling threatened and unsafe. And whether you think that's a reasonable or rational position from Putin, it probably is his reality, and therefore it's one that we need to be in contact with. I was just watching earlier, it's been a 2017 interview with Vladimir Putin from the Financial Times. I think it was one of the first interviews that he'd granted to foreign press in a long time at that point. And he lays down some of his basic views about sovereignty, and that the internal affairs of a state are up to the internal affairs of that state. Now, that might seem a strange position considering he's just invaded a sovereign state. But I think he thinks he's countering the impact of foreign interference, aka the potential of Ukraine to join the EU and NATO, and that for him that's actually not respecting Russia's security and needs. Now again, we could debate that, but the reality is, if that's really informing his actions, then at some point we've got to be in touch with his reality. If you haven't watched that interview, I recommend you're watching it, because they also ask him about how to deal with North Korea. You might remember at the time North Korea was developing its intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there was a kind of a war of words regularly between Trump, then US President, and Kim Jong-il, or is it Kim Jong-un? And Putin's view is, before we talk about whether North Korea has nuclear weapons or doesn't have nuclear weapons, the essential question is, does North Korea feel safe? And I imagine that is the yardstick that he's applying today to Russia. Is Russia safe? And so, although it's obviously fair to say that there hasn't been any obvious aggression towards Russia, no invasion of Russia by NATO or Ukraine. The same could be said of North Korea, right? There's no active invasion, and yet, with the whole world kind of banding together to try and prevent North Korea having nuclear weapons, and North Korea looking at what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and if you're a failed state, it's easy for Western powers to kind of roll in and start trying to determine what you as a country should be doing. Maybe, just maybe, in that context, it's not actually completely illogical to feel unsafe and threatened. Basically, if you're not a democracy in today's world, at some level you're under threat because you're not part of the club. Now, am I a fan of democracy? Yes. Do I think democracy needs to go a lot further than today? Yes. But my wanting a country to be democratic and its wanting itself to be democratic and having the history and the culture and the institutions to create a democracy are two very different things. And this was Putin's exact point when he was talking about the American desire to seed democracy in North African and Middle Eastern states, which ultimately was a failed project. That actually it's not for outsiders to determine whether a country is democratic. And in fact, what this recent history seems to show is it doesn't work anyway to try and give people their democratic freedoms, right? It's got to be some kind of upward upwelling of democratic sentiment. It's the same thing in coaching. You can't just coach people into realities that they're not themselves at least curious about, drawn to, ready for, asking questions about, and so on. So I think it's simplistic in some ways to just see this as democracy versus authoritarianism, or even just competing nationalisms. It's actually about safety, and it's probably about being heard, and it would seem that, again, you could argue whether this should be the reality, but if we start with what someone's experience, Putin's experience is he hasn't been heard. And ever since this 2008 Bucharest Declaration, NATO coming out and saying that that Georgia and Ukraine are going to be admitted to NATO, Russia's made it clear that it's not happening, or it's not happy with that. And again, we could say, well, okay, you don't like it, Russia, there's lots of things that countries don't like that their neighbors end up doing. But if this whole situation were reversed, let's just put an alternative scenario. Let's imagine for the moment that in the next 20 years, Canada and Mexico form deep alliances with communist China, and over time see themselves as staging grounds for Chinese military installations, and eventually Chinese troops and Chinese security guarantees. Do you think that America would stand back and say, we just respect the democratic will of the Canadians and the Mexicans, and if they want to be deeply in bed with the Chinese and receive all manner of financial and military assistance from them and be a staging ground for their troops, that we're okay with that? I just don't believe that they would be. Now, technically this is called the Monroe Doctrine, and it kind of says, what happens in this hemisphere is America's business. And back in the day, obviously, to Europe, stay out of our business. And I think Putin has his own version of the American Monroe Doctrine. It basically says, this is in our backyard, don't mess. Don't start putting your American-led institutions into our back garden. We're not going to stand for it. So I'm just inviting reflection about whether if this were completely reversed, whether actually the actions would be as different as the rhetoric from the West might lead us to believe. Now, none of this is to suggest that what's happening is moral or just. It isn't. None of it's to suggest that Putin's not authoritarian, a thug, a bully. All those things may be true, but it's just inviting a little bit more nuance into the narrative. At the same time, obviously at the human level, this is completely devastating and unacceptable. I felt personally really sad and powerless, and I've had lots of tears. I'm looking at the TV and I'm watching something that I thought I only really saw on Netflix World War II documentaries. I know what it's like to feel without a sense of home, but that's generally been within a context of, at least at some level, my own making, meaning if I really wanted to go and rent a studio apartment that I could, it just hasn't felt like the right place or the right time, or that it's easily coming together for me for a variety of factors. But to be evicted from your home, to have men mandated, right? People have made a lot of noise here about vaccines, and we can talk about that. It seems to me that's quite a different level of state mandate than if you're a male between the ages of 18 and 60, it's illegal for you to leave. You need to stay and bear arms. My imagination is a lot of them are doing that voluntarily. But imagine that just one day you've got to make that decision. Do I stay? Do I try and get out? If I get out, am I going to be deemed an abandoner or be imprisoned? Meanwhile, there's women and children at the borders queuing up for, more than a day to try and get across a border. It's a humanitarian cluster. The other thing I'll just throw in is this, if you've had the experience of feeling powerless, or maybe you're wondering what you can do, humanitarian aid matters, right? So you could go to UNICEF as one of the first places to look to donate. The other thing that you can start to think of just in yourself is, at some point we've got to create a set of 21st institutions to handle 21st century problems. The United Nations, right? They're sitting in the United Nations, making their declarations, each country, right? A lot of it incredibly articulate. I was listening to declarations from representatives from Ghana and Kenya, and loved everything they had to say. And everyone knows that at a certain point this is going to go to a vote on the Security Council, right? We've got the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the so-called victors in World War II, China, France, UK, US, Russia, and Russia's going to veto. So all this whole thing in some ways is just, in the sense of actual political outcomes, it's a charade that doesn't have any teeth, that can't actually mobilize and take action at this time, when time is literally, obviously, so much of the essence. So we need a better way to run the world than was possible politically to create in 1945. I know it, you know it, most people know it. It's not sexy, it's not obvious how to do better. It's just not It's not fair that 5 countries get to determine policy for the rest of the world. And also, let's just be clear, we're talking about the United Nations, a remarkable institution ahead of its time, but that runs on a budget that's half the size of the state of Minnesota. I mean, this is just not a politically and economically strong institution for the kind of governance to actually prevent this sort of humanitarian catastrophe. So I invite you into that conversation about what institutions do we need? How would we create the kind of political awareness and popular political will to push for those kind of institutions? We're here on the back of, now coming into its 3rd year of pandemic. We know that the global institutions we had weren't really fit for that purpose. So we've all had experiences of how, better early warning systems would have helped, the ability to have more coordinated policies and action across countries and regions when it comes to vaccine IP, when it comes to distribution of masks and other vital resources, oxygen. So now's the time, I think, that we're being asked to really reconcile with, well, what does it mean to be a 21st century global citizen? What does it mean to be coming into a new political reality? To most people's political sensibilities, it's crazy that this is happening right now. Sort of from the level of, well, we still live in a nation-centric sovereign system where effectively one country can invade another country without recourse to a higher power, a higher system of justice, a higher system of mediation and arbitration. At the end of the day, this is still the floor of that system, and I mean floor as in ceiling floor, that when the chips are down, this is what it devolves into. So we need to think about how to design a system that's not just built upon nation-centric sovereignty, because there's a limit to it. There's a limit to it. Now, maybe you say, well, when countries become, liberal democracies, capitalist liberal democracies, typically they don't go to war with each other, and that seems to be true. There's a sort of stage of development that seems to create kind of ties of commonality, similar worldview. And the reality is, most or much of the world isn't that. And even if that were the case, would it not be great if the law of the jungle didn't reign between nations? Meaning that when the chips are down, it's not just, well, my country's bigger than your country, so kind of back down. I think we can do better than that. I don't have all the answers. I do have a lot of curiosity, and I do want to be in some of those conversations. So if you're looking at this whole thing and thinking, what is there to learn from this? What is redeeming about this? It might just be that this sort of thing in time will force the conversations that actually invite us to evolve together to create a reality and a set of institutions and norms, but particularly maybe institutions where this kind of thing actually doesn't happen. So that's my hope, my prayer. What are you seeing? What's your experience? I'd love to know about it. Leave me a comment and hang in there. I'm sending my love to you if you're watching this from Ukraine or you know people who are there. Love and prayers to you.